Welcome, everyone, to the Writers Bloc Podcast. And I am really excited to meet Lori Ann Wood today. She and I were both commenting that we've seen each other's work online for a very long time. So it's really nice to meet you and to have you in the Writers Bloc. So welcome, Lori Ann.
Oh, thank you. It's such an honor for me to be here with all the other writers that have been with you. It's great.
Yeah, well, we're so glad to have you. And I've been poking around and looking at your website and looking at your video on your website and just a lot of the work that you've done. But tell us, for those who are not familiar, a little bit about yourself, where you live, and your relationship with writing.
I am an empty nester. I have three grown children, and I live in the northwest corner of Arkansas in Walmart country. And I started writing it's probably been about 8 years ago now because of a health diagnosis that I got. And I kind of found my way into writing, not having any training or any background in it, and have just kind of felt my way through the process.
Interesting. Okay, so the health crisis was what kicked off your. Did you have a desire to write before that, or did you just feel like this was a story you needed to steward through writing for other people?
I think, like so many people, I felt like I had a book in me, but in my early life, I thought it would be about how to throw a really great children's birthday party or how to vacation on the cheap. But God had a different idea, and so when this all happened, it became pretty obvious that it was going to become something that I hadn't planned.
Yeah, wouldn't that be fun if we could just choose the trajectory of our lives based on the books we want to write? And
Right.
throwing parties and vacationing and instead it's through a lot of suffering, a lot of hardship. Well, tell us a little about your story that led to your book that we can see in the background, The Divine Detour.
Yes. So this all started about 10 years ago. I had a medical evaluation for a life insurance policy and to see if I could get preferred life insurance. And I did. And they told me at that evaluation that I had less than 3% chance of ever developing heart disease in my lifetime. And
Wow.
I wasn't very surprised at that because I've always been super healthy. I've always had low blood pressure and low cholesterol, and I'm never in the hospital, and I didn't take any prescription medications at all. Well, about 3 weeks after they told me that, I wasn't feeling well. And it was Thanksgiving week of 2015. And I had kids still at home, and I had kids coming home from college. And I thought, I've got to get my act together because I've got a lot of momming to do this week. And so I went to convenient care a couple of times, trying to figure out why I was so sluggish and why I just didn't have any energy. And they gave me an antibiotic and they gave me an inhaler. And then on Thanksgiving, I just couldn't even get out of bed. I could hear laughter and dishes and my kids, and I just couldn't be with them. And then the next day was Black Friday. And on that day, my husband got up early and called our PCP and insisted that I be seen that day by that doctor. And I'm alive today because he did that. Because my doctor now tells me, as I was sitting on the floor of our bedroom struggling to put my socks on for that appointment, I was about to die. Well, we did make it to the PCP's office, and he listened to my heart with a stethoscope, and he said, if we're lucky, it's pneumonia. And the chest x-ray he took didn't show pneumonia, but it showed an extremely enlarged heart. And so I was direct admitted into cardiac ICU where I spent 2 weeks. And I learned on the first day that I had end stage heart failure and my heart was functioning at just 6%, which
Mm.
really threw me completely off because I had no family history and I had no risk factors. You know, if I had made a list of everything I was worried about ever happening to me, I would have had car wrecks and cancer at the top, but heart disease wouldn't have even been on the list. So
Mm.
I was flown to Cleveland Clinic and became my doctor's most critical patient there for a year and a half. And she recently told me that when she first saw me, my heart was the largest heart she'd ever seen. And so I wore an external defibrillator vest for 9 months, and I took on all the medications that they could find to the maximum dosages. And then we waited 16 months, and I had no improvement despite people praying for me around the clock. And despite doing everything I knew to do physically, I was begging my doctors to increase my meds to give me a chance because they were saying, the optimistic doctors were saying plan on 5 years, and the more realistic ones were saying you better think more about 6 months. And
Mm.
they sent me home with a hospice binder, and it was a very strange period of time because I was struggling with this idea that this health that I thought I would have for many more years was gone. But more importantly, I started to really look at my faith in a different way.
Yeah, and so what was the result of that? I mean, how did you overcome all that?
Well, it's been a strange ride, and this is just kind of how heart failure is. I needed my appendix out in 2017, and no one wanted to operate on me with my weak heart. And at that moment, they tested my heart again and found out that somehow, against all medical odds, my heart function had returned to near normal. And I thought that was the end of my story. I thought my story was one of divine healing and answered prayer and God's provision. And then about 2 years later, my heart function dropped and I found myself in active heart failure again. And then earlier this year, I had a stroke. And so it's been this ongoing heart failure is a chronic progressive disease. For most people, medical science can help manage the symptoms. And for some, they can slow the progression, but there really is no cure. It only goes in one direction. So what I thought was this temporary detour turned out to be this completely different life road. And I have been in addition to having the stroke in February, in July, I was evaluated for a heart transplant at the Cleveland Clinic. And so there's just been a lot of medical stuff along the way. And there's been sort of what I felt like was a back and forth with God about Him restoring my heart. And then I felt like that miracle was almost ripped away from me, and I was back in heart failure again. And just lots and lots of questions that came up during that whole journey and still do. And I think the way I handled it at first was a friend of mine dropped by a little notebook at my hospital room when I was first diagnosed, and just a little spiral notebook. And I think she meant for me to write doctor's instructions or prescriptions or something in there. And what it became was when the nurses would come in the middle of the night to check my vitals and all of that, they would wake me up, and then I couldn't go back to sleep. And so I started writing in that notebook kind of angsty stuff like, what's going on? I don't know where you're going with this. Why are you not answering our prayers? Where are you? Why are you so silent? And all of these things were coming out of me. And I'm thinking, when I get past this and my life comes back together, I'm going to burn this little notebook and I'm going to feel really good about it. And well, then I learned about heart failure being this chronic progressive disease, and I still have that notebook. And at one point, my husband said, about a year into it, he said, "Are you still writing all this down?" And I said, "No," because I didn't want to ever remember this part of my life. I wanted it to be a distant memory, and I wanted to move on from it. And he said, "You should be." And so I sort of started going back to that journal and just writing down pieces of feelings and things I was thinking at the time. And that became a jumping off point for a book that I never would have taken the time to write in a safer, healthier life.
Hmm. So your book came out of those journaling entries.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and so that's so interesting because you said you never wanted to remember it, and yet it was because of your remembering that much fruit has been born from that process. So can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, we're talking about writing from scars. And so can you tell us a little bit about how, like, what kind of time frame were you looking at in terms of how much distance did you have from those memories, those scars, that you actually began to start writing?
Yeah. So this happened at the end of 2015. And I started writing about 2018, and then my book came out in 2023. So several years before I really started writing about what was happening, and then several more years before it became a book. But I think the important thing that I realized at some point is I thought, okay, I'm going to just tell my story. And then it became obvious to me at some point that my story is not that unique. There's a lot of people that have stories of a detour, whether it's health or family or finance. And I didn't think that me just telling my story was what God was telling me to do. And so I started looking for ways to share just bits and pieces of what was happening. And so I could only write in short periods of time because that was all the mental ability I had at that time, just because of trauma and everything that was going on. So I was writing in these little 1,000-word pieces, and it was just whatever happened to come up in my mind, like in my journal entry. And so I would expand on that and really dig into it. And they became these dozens and dozens of just what felt like disjointed pieces. And that was probably the most difficult part of writing the book, was figuring out what's God, what do you want me to do with all these bits and pieces that really don't have a format? And it was at that point that I was in a Bible study and we were looking at Jesus's detour into the desert. And I became aware at that point that his three temptations in the desert were really just three questions that he was confronted with, that he had to answer for himself. And I thought, those are the same three questions that all of these little pieces I'm doing could fit into. And so I put them on sticky notes and put them all over a wall and started moving them around into these three questions, what became in the book the three life questions. And that was what happened. And the kind of cool thing about it is I knew I was writing in small pieces because I needed to. But what I didn't realize at the time is that people that needed to read it, they also had shortened attention spans because of trauma and suffering. And so they needed to read it and digest it in short pieces that were easily completed and they could pick up and put down.
So yeah, that's isn't that sweet the way God works, right? He just uses available vessels. He gives you a limited amount of energy and bandwidth, and yet that's exactly his plan all along. So I think that's an encouraging thing for writers to remember, that it's often in our weakness, it's often in our feeling of I don't have what I need, that God is able. And so that's such a sweet way that God works. But so can you tell us a little bit about those three questions and more about the format of your book?
Sure. So the three questions that really are not verbatim the temptations, but the temptations of Jesus inspired these three questions. And the first one I called a question of worry. Is this life all there is? Excuse me. And then the second is a question of doubt, which is God always good? And the third one is a question of control. Is God's plan enough? And, I think those always kind of nag at the back of our mind throughout our life. But when we get thrown off on this major life detour, they demand our attention. And I think most of us maybe aren't so much looking for the exact answer to that question as they are just permission to explore that question.
Hmm. And is that the process that you take people through in your book?
Yes, in fact, what my book is a collection of 40 essays, those 40 short pieces or micro chapters, and they are a piece of my story, just a little piece from my journal. Then there's some story either from my childhood or from raising children or my current life. And I try to weave that in with scripture to show that the empathetic, the part that makes us the same. And those stories were what I think connected to other people, where they would say, I didn't do exactly what you did. I don't have exactly your detour, but boy, it sounds so familiar. I like to say that my story rhymes with theirs because it's not the same story, but it sounds very familiar.
Mm. So, yeah, can you talk to us a little bit about the idea of detours then, and just like what does that mean? What does that look like? How do you remain faithful and steadfast in the midst of a detour? Because there's so much confusion and questions that usually come up in a detour. We don't really, by nature, it's not our plan, right? So,
Exactly. Yeah, and when you think about Jesus going into the desert, he had just been baptized, came out of the baptismal waters, and God said, "This is my son who I'm so pleased with." And the very next words in scripture are, he was led into the desert to be tempted by the devil. And so it was right from I'm proud of you, I love you, a dove coming down, alighting on his head, to you're going to be tempted in the desert. And so that shouldn't be surprising to us that we find ourselves on a detour. Jesus was ready to begin that life, the world changing ministry that he was embarking on, and he had to spend 40 days on this detour. And like you were saying, when we think of a detour, what it is it's that route we didn't choose. We didn't expect this. If we set our GPS on our phone or in our car, we pick the smoothest, the safest, the most direct, the fastest route to where we want to go. And sometimes we're going along that path and we see a sign that says detour and we get thrown off on this little side road. And it's not the smoothest, the safest, the prettiest route you've ever seen. It might be the loss of a child or divorce or bankruptcy or loss of some other kind of dream. And you just end up on this bumpy, yucky road you don't want to be on. And that's what I felt like when I was facing this heart failure. I said, I didn't plan this. This isn't what I wanted. It's not comfortable. And it creates so many questions because I think so many times we're led to believe that if if we're God's child, he's taking care of us and everything that happens to us will turn out into something good in our lifetime so that we don't have to ever suffer, especially long term. And so that detour became the title of the book is Divine Detour because it's a path I didn't choose. And I think most of us are on a path that, or will be on a path that we didn't choose for ourselves. And sometimes it's because of a choice we made, and sometimes it's because of a choice someone else made, or
mhm.
sometimes it's just living in a fallen world. But most of us end up on that kind of a detour, not the path we wanted to be on or the path that we envisioned to be on.
I did some writing on Jesus's temptation as well this year, and one of the details of that story that I thought was so interesting was it said, "And the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness," and so it was really the Lord's doing. And I think as believers, we can acknowledge that if God is sovereign over all of our detours. You know, it's not just the straight paths that we give him glory for, but also the detours. And those are often harder. But if the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan, um, that he's also leading us in our detours. So that hopefully that's an encouragement to believers, but also sometimes it's kind of a we have to reckon with that, make peace with that, and hopefully that brings some comfort as well.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, and I think when you title your book, they say the title is the premise, which is Divine Detour, and then the subtitle is the promise. And I think the promise, what you were talking about there, was when you're on that detour, it can lead to the faith you've always wanted. It might be the path you would never choose, but there's something at the end of that path or along that path that you've always wanted, and maybe you didn't even know you wanted it or needed it, but that's where the Spirit comes in.
Yeah, and so that's an excellent point. So what are your hopes? Especially I think sometimes when we're writing from a place of a scar, um, past hurt and trauma, there's a balance there in how we convey our hard stories. Did you find that to be a struggle to make the the struggles that you were writing about and writing from like universal, like pulling out some sort of universal lesson that other people can glean from you? Like how did you know like this is a story I want to put in and this is a story I don't think needs to go in?
It was tricky because there were one thing is I always have someone else read it after I've written something before it becomes, public, because our stories overlap so much with so many other people. And I think that's a big part of being on a detour is generationally, we might be living in the shadow of someone else's hard story or someone else's detour. And it becomes even trickier about what do I share and what I don't share. But even just for ourselves, we want to share enough so that, they say to wait a while after you have, if you're writing from your wound, it's too soon. You need to write from your scars. And you have to judge for yourself when you're healed enough to be able to share it because you want to have perspective on it. And what I found in sharing parts of my journal entries were that while I didn't want to share it, I didn't want to write it and then the very next day share my journal entry because I needed to get perspective on it. I also knew that if I didn't write it down and share what I was thinking at that moment, that's the point where the reader sees you and knows that you understand their pain. If you're sharing a little piece of your pain, that's when the reader says, "Oh, she gets it because I'm feeling that pain." But you also have to be far enough away from it that you can see it for what it is. And that's, I think, for me, took 3 years before I could really share anything. Even though I was still writing, I wasn't sharing it. So I think that helps. And everybody's a little bit different, but also I would caution to just, since our stories overlap so much, make sure that it's your story to share. And if you're in doubt, have someone else read it that understands both sides.
Yeah, that's wise. Yeah, an outside perspective because sometimes we're too close. We don't think about what maybe some of the consequences of sharing certain stories might be. So, yeah, that's a good point. And what tell me again, what was the subtitle of your book? You said The Promise.
It's the path you'd never choose can lead to the faith you've always wanted.
Yeah, so I'm sure that as you're thinking through, what to include and what not, you're asking yourself those questions like, does this lead my reader to a more hopeful end, right? And
Mhm.
so, I think that that helps become like a litmus test for us as we think about what belongs, what doesn't belong in this kind of writing. Um, yeah, so. Looking ahead, are there other like, well, first of all, let me ask you this. Is this a traditionally or self-published book?
Traditionally,
Okay. Do you have subsequent projects that you're looking to do that kind of have spun off of this one?
I do. I'm working on another one. It's not taken the form of, it doesn't have uh, bones to it yet, but it's got the flesh is there. So I need to spend some time getting that into the format because when I started Divine Detour, like I said, it was just a bunch of sticky notes, and I didn't know how many of those sticky notes were going to become a book. And I settled on the idea of 40 because in scripture, 40 is trial or testing. Moses fasted for 40 days. The Israelites wandered for 40 years. Noah was 40 days in the ark. Elijah suffered for 40 days. So many 40-day stories. But what I also realized in those 40-day stories is 40 is also God's environment for change. It's the threshold to something new. And so that's what I really wanted to hold on to. And I haven't found that same cohesive element yet in what I'm working on. So I'm hoping that with prayer and the Spirit leading again, we can find another, the cohesion that's going to make that second book come together.
Because you're trying to kind of follow the same format as your first book. Is that right?
Yes, I'm finding that for me, my sweet spot are these small micro chapters that are kind of standalone. And I've had people tell me that they like them because they can just read one at a time and be finished. And they don't feel like they start a book and do I come back to it or not? Because they can pick it up anywhere and reread them. It's a little bit like a children's book in that way, is that it's a small story and you can reread it again and again and again, or skip around to different chapters depending on what's, what appeals to you at that time. And so I think that is where I'm leaning on this second book as well.
Okay, that's interesting. Kind of becomes part of your brand as a writer, so that's cool. Um, I imagine what people might be wondering is if you were just starting to write when you were after you had suffered this medical episode, how did you get traditionally published? Because generally you have to be building a platform in order to get the looks that traditional publishers want. So how did that work out for you?
Right. So my publisher is a small Christian publisher that does not require an agent. And they have been, I think what happened on my book was it happened to hit at a time where the acquisitions editor was going through something in her life that was pretty similar as far as a serious health situation, and it really resonated with her. And the also was the fact that when I pitched the book, it was pretty much already written. And that's usually not how it works with nonfiction. But I had just had those little pieces and had them figured out how they were going to go together, and really wanted to share that short format chapter, standalone chapter idea. And that really resonated with them as well. So sometimes you just have to hit at the right time. And sometimes it's just, an idea that they want to try. And so they had never done a book like that and ended up doing that.
Yeah, that's cool. That's encouraging too. I noticed too on your website, you've just received a ton of awards for it. So was that something, have you been submitting your book for into, you know, literary contests and that kind of thing to get awards?
Yes, and that's been helpful as well because it's connected me with not only just having the award and being able to showcase that, but also I've made so many connections with other writers that I never would have connected with that were also involved in that in that particular contest or award. And that's been one of the biggest blessings, is just making connections, because you may have someone that competes with you in that same category, and then you know that you're going to have similar audiences, and you know that you're going to have overlap in what you're doing and can support each other on social media and collaborations. And that's just been a huge thing, was just the other writers that I was able to connect with in those. But definitely, and you have to be a little bit careful on the awards. I try to have sort of a limit. Some of them have a really high entry fee, and I stay away from any of those that have a high entry fee, or, um, and I try to do some research on the different award programs to make sure that there's something that's recommended, and to make sure that it has a category for your book. Some of them really don't have a category that would fit every book.
Well, I'm just impressed with the way you've chosen to market. I mean, as a first-time author and using this book as kind of the jumping off point for your platform, I'm just impressed. I think it's great that you've just gone for it and applied and received all of these awards. So I think that's really smart. I think it's a great way to get your book and name recognition out there, more people seeing your book. Have you noticed any sort of, you know, windfall from that? Any, more readers, more sales, that kind of thing? Has it translated in that way?
It's kind of hard to tell when you're traditionally published, because I don't really have that real time as a self-published author might have the data that's real time on the sales, but I do think it has helped in as far as maybe mostly in getting speaking engagements, because you can show if someone's looking for a speaker in the area of your book, when they see that it's won awards, then they feel like, okay, I don't have to vet it as much because it's already been given these awards. And I feel like it's gotten some speaking engagements that I wouldn't have otherwise.
That's cool. Yeah, it's great to know. Well, I'd love for the ladies on this call, if you guys have any questions or comments for Lorianne before we wrap up.
Well, I just would say I'm anxious to read your book and study it some more, but I'm also curious as how you're doing.
I'm doing I just had an appointment with my neurologist last week and my cardiologist yesterday, and my neurologist was like, "You're doing great. You're doing great. And from where we came, you are doing so good." And I'm talking post-stroke. And then yesterday, my cardiologist, we were just laughing because we're like, "Can you believe we've been doing this for 10 years?" And he said, "We've been so blessed because
Hmm.
I have dodged so many bullets." And I just take that as I mean, it's nothing that I'm doing, but I'm just going to keep charging forward as much as I can. So, but thank you for asking. That's very sweet.
Yeah, the Lord's using you in this season of suffering, so that's great.
Well, and if you ever need help when you're up at Cleveland Clinic, my childhood best friend knows the Cleveland Clinic backwards and forwards. She's been in cardiac, she's been in transplant, she's been in nephrology, so she's got it pretty well
They're
handled.
so good. They're so good. I've been so blessed with medical care. I'm just amazing. Yeah, they're wonderful.
I was just at my Bible study this morning and we were talking about Jeremiah 31, 33, I believe, where he prophesies, the Lord says he was going to give them a new heart, a new instead of tablets of
Mm.
stone, a heart of flesh. And so I hope you don't need a new heart, but it sounds like God has been using your heart to just really share God's word and his hope with others. And um, yeah, maybe some analogies have been made with that already in your book, but I was just thinking that that is a sweet analogy for you, especially.
Yes, that was one thing. When we went to Cleveland Clinic in July, they put me through the transplant, that whole workup to see if I was ready, and they found that I'm not ready yet, which I was so grateful for because I didn't want to go through that. So they think I probably will get there. But right now I'm functioning well enough that I don't need a new heart. So I'm grateful
Oh,
for that.
praise God for that. Well, Rosemary chimed in on this, and this was actually going to be my follow-up question anyway. What you're going to be teaching us on Thursday? Can you share a little bit about what you're planning to share?
Yes. So I'm going to share a little bit more about how I incorporated my journal into the micro chapters in the book and how I knew what to include and how I decided that I think figuring out not only how it was going to come together, but what order it was going to come together was just, I felt like that took me forever to figure out. But so I want to share a little bit about sharing journal, and why you should be journaling, even if you don't think you're ever going to put it in your book. And then I also want to talk about the power of stories because that's, there's some science even behind why stories are so powerful. And so we're going to talk about that as well and how that all can come together in different ways, maybe unexpected ways that you hadn't thought of.
I'm looking forward to that. I think that'll be really good. So Lorianne, where can people find you and find your work, find your book?
Yes. So more about my book, there's a book trailer, and you can read the first chapter free at loriannwood.com/books. And it's available on Amazon. It's available from my publisher as well, and lots of different other retail places. And all those links are on that books page. And I would love to connect with anyone. There's a contact form on my website. I would love to contact anybody on social media. I'm just Lorianne Wood on Instagram and Facebook. So
That's
reach
great.
out. I love to hear other people's stories. It encourages me when bits of my story or bits of my thoughts or my struggles show up in someone else's story. So
Yeah, it's one of those things where you can say, "Oh, I thought I was the only one."
yep.
You too, like this
Uh-huh.
famous C.S. Lewis quote.
Yep.
Oh, well, Lorianne, thank you so much for joining us today, sharing your story. We're grateful and thankful for what God's done in and through you, and excited to learn more from you on Thursday.
No, thank you for having me. I'm excited about it too.
All right, we'll see everyone on Thursday. Take care.